please join me in welcoming Nancy Crumbine.
Thanks, Wendy. Am I too loud? No? Okay. Don't you love librarians? They're just amazing. I feel really too loud. Yeah, but it's echoing at me, no? Can't do anything about it? Okay. Thank you to Wendy for having me. Thank you to Allie White, who organizes the First Wednesday programs, the Vermont Humanities Council. Thank you to my students at Dartmouth College, and to Henry David Thoreau and E.B. White for this talk tonight. I'm glad to be back. I was here 4 years ago, Wendy said, talking about Rumi and some other spiritual poets. And I want to come back, and please put this on your evaluation. I want to come back and give my talk on E.B. White for you. It's a lot of reading of E.B. White, because who can say anything about him? He writes so beautifully. It is, sorry, I'm going to tape this myself. It is June 2018. And the planet is in such danger that we can barely speak about it. All of us, even committed environmentalists, need at times to turn away and get a break from the terrible daily news and the dire predictions made even before this current Neanderthal regression. Thought that was diplomatically put. The United Kingdom Guardian wrote at the 50th anniversary of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's legacy is difficult to assess. More than any other individual, she helped raise awareness about humanity's potential to wreak havoc on nature, and we should be grateful. But it is equally clear that the planet is in a far worse state today than it was in 1962. The population has risen from 3.1 billion to 6.9 billion. It has doubled in my lifetime. Seas are being drained of fish, wild places destroyed, etc. However bleak it looks now, know that it looked as bleak in the 1950s and 60s. As hopeless as it appears to us now, it appeared many times to Rachel Carson just as hopeless. When she wrote Silent Spring, she knew well it would not stop the destruction or save the planet, yet she persisted, knowing with faith that it made a small difference, that it began a movement, and that there would be those of us after her who would carry on her legacy. Through her painful last dying years, to her very last breath, she fought for this planet, her fellow species, the totality of the biosphere, with tireless devotion. Why spend a night with Rachel Carson? Why view a past that is so far gone and seemingly ineffective? I can only answer that question personally. And I hope to show you my answer tonight by showing you her courage and her persistence, her faith in the possibility of human humility, all of which inform and inspire me on a daily basis. My goal tonight is to inspire you to read or reread all of her books, to discover how timely and important they are, even more so today than when she wrote them. My hope is that they will lift you up as they do me and inspire all of us to action, global, local, in as many ways possible that we can act in her name. So, that said, I have books over here of Rachel Carson. I collect some of my books about her and by her. I have my own book for sale, and all the proceeds go to environmental causes. Earth Justice and NRDC, but if you have suggestions, I'm open to them. I have a bibliography on this table as well of books about Carson, but I also want to draw your attention because on Netflix, as of today at least, American Experiences documentary called Rachel Carson. It was done in 2017. My mic is slipping, sorry. It's a fabulous documentary on Netflix now called Rachel Carson, American Experience, Rachel Carson. So I really hope you have a chance to look at that. Also, you can just go to YouTube and search Rachel Carson, and you can get lots of amazing footage, including the entire CBS report that Eric Sevareid did. And I will be talking more about that. And it's really worth watching the entire episode, the entire thing. Okay. Before I begin with Carson herself, I want a quick review of the times leading up to this little woman from a poor, polluted town outside of poor, polluted Pittsburgh. Leading up to this, the times that led up to this shy, quiet woman writing a book that changed us utterly. This small Davidic voice, which took on the Goliath chemical industry and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This little voice that began the environmental movement in this country. We could start, of course, with the wild Unitarians in Concord, Massachusetts. Since I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister, I don't mind starting there. Thoreau, of course, much more wild than Emerson, as Thoreau believed that other species, including trees, had as much right to this earth as we do. Thoreau, as you may know, received one of the first copies of Origin of Species of any American in the United States. He read it cover to cover and wrote Darwin immediately. Darwin, at the end of that book, calls for scientists to corroborate his theory. And Thoreau wrote him immediately and said, I will be one of you. And you can, if you read Thoreau's journals, you see this incredible change after he's written Darwin, and his journals become much more scientific, and he's collecting all this data for Darwin's theory. So I could also start this talk with Calvin, 1600s in Geneva, Switzerland, the great theologian against whom Unitarian Universalists still rant, though in this context, his theology of nature, taken up by the Presbyterians. Rachel Carson's mother was a deeply devout Presbyterian. Calvin's understanding of nature as God's creation. And here's some hopeful piece of this. And if nature is God's creation, you don't mess it up. It's the sin of pride, Calvin said, to mess it up. Which are words that Rachel Carson uses in her work. So the very strong influence from the good side of Presbyterianism. I could give a whole lecture on her mother, Maria Carson. I won't, but she had a huge influence on Rachel. They were very close, and she supported her until her death. Okay, but let's go back to Thoreau. His journals were at Carson's bedside for the last 30 years of her life. She read from Thoreau's journals every night. Think about Whitman's Leaves of Grass, John Muir's Sierra Club, founded in 1892. We're going to think about our Audubon Society, the importance of women in the Audubon Society, another whole lecture. Henry Benson's The Outermost House, anyone read that? 1924, a favorite of Rachel Carson's. Roger Peterson's Field Guide to the Birds came out in 1934. There was a lot of attention being paid. The Wilderness Society formed in 1935. A lot of interest. But let's focus on the 50s and early 60s. Do you remember them? Anybody here old enough to remember the 50s? DuPont. Remember DuPont, the darling of America? Their slogan, anyone remember it? Better things for better living through chemistry. Close, yeah. Progress is our most important product. Very good. There's a rumor that Kurt Vonnegut was working for GE at the time and created that slogan. I've never believed it. It's impossible to exaggerate the reverence people had for science and industry, in particular chemistry and weapons, in the 50s. They were the only things that would save us from our two most fearsome enemies, insects and Russians. Yes. And one of the things that kept us ahead of Russians, supposedly, was the insecticides, all the chemistry that allowed us to have food on the table, never mind that it was all tainted. Nature Conservancy, founded in 1951. John Kenneth Galbraith, anybody read The Affluent Society, 1958? Carson read it with great interest and woke her up to the consumerism and the ties, the deep, dark ties between science and industry and government, which we know now from the sugar industry, from the oil industry, and from the tobacco industries. Then some other things happening in the 50s. The fire ant eradication. 20 million acres sprayed with DDT by the Department of Agriculture to get rid of fire ants. Quote, the area reeked with the odor of decaying wildlife. Because, of course, it didn't kill just the fire ants, it killed everything else in its path. 57, 58, the Dutch elm disease. Remember that? Long Island and everywhere else sprayed, Long Island spraying, which provoked a court case that ended up in the Supreme Court, and we'll talk about that a little later. It provided a lot of material for Rachel Carson's book. 1959, the strontium 90 in the dairy supply. They found toxic substance in baby. There was a survey of baby teeth. E.B. White was writing about fallout in the New Yorker. Remember the cranberry contamination in Oregon, which freaked out the whole country? Yeah, right before Thanksgiving. And then there were all the politicians eating cranberry, gobs of cranberry, trying to get the poor industry back on its feet. That's all in that documentary on Netflix. By 57, 6,000 different synthetic pesticides were on the market, all untested. Remember thalidomide, the late 50s. One of the, and she ties that together in some of her talks. Another spate of nuclear tests in Nevada, 1962. The Environmental Defense Fund is started in 67, etc. And there, among all this, was Rachel Carson, scientist, writer, hardest worker this earth has ever known, writing in severe pain all night long, racing against her own death to finish this book, Silent Spring. It was serialized in the New Yorker beginning in June 62 and out as a book, Houghton Mifflin, with Paul Brooks as the editor. I have one of his books here, September 1962, with the main message that the arrogance of human beings was the most dangerous thing on this planet. A call for humility, a call for a balance, understanding the balance of nature. The beginning, really, of understanding ecology. So, who was this woman and how did she do it? How did this little woman from Pittsburgh, from a poor family in Pittsburgh, create a paradigm shift that would change our understanding of the world? I'm going to go through, I'm just going to do chronology. It reads like a mystery, really, in a way. It just unfolds. So she was born in 1907, again, small house in a tiny little town, deeply polluted from coal industry and steel. It's still polluted. I'm told that her house has anyone been to her house in Springdale? It's open as a museum, but a friend of mine who lives in Pittsburgh said, don't go, Nancy. After you're in the house for an hour, you come outside your house, your car will be covered in coal ash. It's a tragic image. She went to Chatham College in Pittsburgh, an all-women's college called Pennsylvania College for Women at the time. And the reason I mention that is because that was my first teaching job. When I graduated from Penn State, I went to teach at Chatham for 4 years. And two women that need naming and should be known in history. Grace Croft was her English teacher there at Chatham. And she was fresh from Radcliffe, so she was close in age. They were very close friends. It was assumed that Rachel would major in English. She was very talented. She was clearly a star at Chatham at the time. But then she took biology and fell in love with her biology teacher, Mary Scott Skinker. I use that phrase loosely now. I will make it more intentional later. And lo and behold, she fell in love with biology and switched her major. But the fact that she was in love with both these fields is what allowed her to be the incredible writer that she was. Without her ability to write and her dedication to really excellent writing, use of metaphor, etc., we'll talk about that later, The Silent Spring certainly would not have been the bestseller that it was and had the impact that it did. Thanks to Mary Scott Skinker, she went to Woods Hole after she graduated from Chatham, and for the first time saw the ocean. And to those of you who don't know, her life thereafter was devoted to the ocean. Then she went on to Johns Hopkins, where she got a master's in zoology and would have gone on to get a PhD, but was taken up with family difficulties. Her father died, and then her sister left 2 children, so she ended up supporting her mother and 2 nieces. And then she ends up, in the end, taking care of her grandnephew and adopting him at age 10 as the sole provider. So her personal life all the way through was burdened very heavily with financial difficulties. In fact, she worked for the U.S. Fish and Game Wildlife Service from 35 to 51 until when See Around Us was so popular, it brought in enough money that she could leave work and write full time. So in 41 was her first book that was published, Under the Sea Wind, and it was published 5 days before we entered World War II. So despite excellent reviews, no one was going to sit around and read a book about the ocean at the beginning of that war. So it really disappeared. It was republished after See Around Us. Her second book was so popular, and it was really popular. It's a beautiful, all 3 of her books about the ocean are beautiful. The last one, The Edge of the Sea, also exquisite. While she was at Fish and Game, or the first few years, she was asked to write brochures for the Wildlife Service. And her boss, who was wonderful to even hire her, because of course women weren't hired for things in those days, Elmer Higgins is his name, and another name that deserves our remembering. When she showed him the draft of the brochure he had asked her to write, he said, "Oh, that's a little bit much for us. You should send it to the Atlantic." How's that for a boss, right? And she does. And they publish it. The Atlantic Monthly, it's still the case, one of the most prestigious essay publishers in the country. Also Unitarian roots, by the way, I can't help saying. She published her first article her first grown-up article. She had published as a child, but her first article in Atlantic Monthly in 1937. Her first book comes out, as I said, in 41. In 44, she becomes aware of the problems of DDT and other toxic substances. She's foremost a scientist, and she has access to a lot of material through her job. She approaches the Reader's Digest, and she suggests that she write an article about this. And what do you think the Reader's Digest responded? Yeah, why? Too unpleasant. Our readers don't want to read about something like that.
And yet they wrote the cigarette thing.
The Reader's Digest did?
That's my memory. The first time I became conscious of the cancer and cigarettes and the tar was Reader's Digest.
Yeah, I'm not sure they broke it, though. They're usually secondary to the... Yeah, they're a reprint thing. But in those earlier days, though, they were publishing original stuff. But not this one. That's interesting. I'll have to look that up. In 1948, remember Mary Scott Skinker, the biologist? She was living in Chicago. She fell ill, and Carson flew to see her and be with her before she died. Deep attachments to women all the way through her life. In 1950, Rachel Carson had breast cancer, but was not told. In those days, the doctor would tell your husband, and if you weren't married, he wouldn't tell anyone what the diagnosis was. And it's a very sad fact because it could have bought her quite a lot of time if she had known and treated for it. It turns out then that she had to have a mastectomy years later, and it was too late. The Sea Around Us comes out in 1951 to great acclaim. She gets all sorts of honors, National Book Award, John Burroughs Medal, etc. The Book of the Month Club picks it up, and she becomes really famous. And it's the first book it was serialized by the New Yorker, and it was the first book about a non-human subject that the New Yorker had published. I just thought it was really interesting. Because their whole message is that we aren't the center of the universe, we humans. We are part of an ecological system. In 1953, because of the money she had made from the book, she was, as I said, she was able to quit her day job in 1951. And she'd been visiting Maine, the Maine shoreline. She absolutely loved it. And in 1953, she moved up to Southport Island and bought a small cottage there. And she received, a couple of days later, a letter from a woman 2 cottages down, Dorothy Freeman. And they became fast and dear friends. And without Dorothy, I just don't see how Rachel could have done what she did. They have a whole book of letters between them. Lots of intimate letters have been destroyed. They systematically went through and got rid of all sorts of intimate letters, which is sort of a clue that they were intimate in ways that they wanted to keep secret. But she had a huge influence, it's so wonderful that the granddaughter of Dorothy Freeman published what letters were left, and they are stunning. It's stunning to read them. They're just beautiful. 1953, The Edge of the Sea, the last of her. And then I want to go over again, just to remind you of some other things that were happening in the 50s that were so crucial. Do you remember the radiation exposure in 1954 of the Japanese seamen on the boat Lucky Dragon? Does anyone remember that? Yeah. So you remember above ground nuclear tests. The fallout went, it shows it in the film, this incredible sweep of fallout, and this poor little fishing boat. The men, I think there were 10 fishermen on board. They all died fairly quickly, but they have film footage of them, and it was the first real wake-up about the dangers of fallout, or a dramatic awakening to the public at large. Certainly scientists knew it before then. Also in the 50s, on a brighter side, is Rachel Carson always along the way was concerned about getting to children, how to help children experience the wonder of nature, which she had been given by her mother. She was outside all the time as a kid. Her mother, there was a whole nature movement that it was really important to get children out into nature. We're getting a little resurgence of that now, but I must say I despair with my Dartmouth students. Some of them are out and about, but most of them are. So anyway, so let's get back to the bad news of the 50s. The radiation exposure, I've mentioned the fire ants, the Dutch elm disease. Let me say a little bit more about that. So there's a couple in Long Island, Marjorie Spock, sister of Ben Spock, Remember Ben Spock? I actually had the privilege of meeting him. He was like 7 feet tall, it looked like. Marjorie Spock and her partner, Mary Richards, had an organic farm on Long Island, and they were very upset when the DDT planes came through and sprayed and killed everything. And they, along with Robert Cushman Murphy, launched a suit, Long Island Federal Court, against the toxic chemical pesticides. By the way, these pesticides were sprayed. They were mixed with fuel oil, which is also toxic. So anyway, they pursued this suit for many years. It went through the courts. It finally got to the Supreme Court and tragically was thrown out on a technicality. However, Maria Rodell, who is Rachel's literary agent, also an angel in her life, like really important for 30 years, connected her with Marjorie. And Marjorie sent, every day, she sent more info, all the court stuff, all that stuff from all the scientific stuff that she had collected was sent to Rachel, and it was really, really important in her research on the book. Let me say a little more about that. One of the reasons, a lot of books have been written about Rosa Parks, and all of the accounts say that the reason she was so important in the Montgomery bus boycott was that she was so well connected. She knew everybody through her church groups, whatever. There was this whole network of people that were just ready to rally around her because they knew her. And the same for Rachel Carson. She knew so many scientists. She had a network of scientists. She had a network of women. She had a network of the Audubon Society, all the nature, the garden clubs. All these people knew her from her book and also just from her work. That when she sent letters out requesting scientific data or personal stories, all this stuff came in. She was overloaded with material for this book. So her mother dies. Her mother dies in December of '58. It was a terrible loss. Her mother cooked for her, was a housekeeper for her, cooked for her, and typed. So when she was working all day long, Rachel Carson would stay up all night long writing, and then all day long her mother would type up the manuscript, have it ready for her on her desk after dinner, and Rachel would go upstairs and edit and redo, etc. They had a wonderful working relationship. So it was quite a blow when she died in '58. And Rachel was already working, Carson was already working on Silent Spring at that point. And she says that she was very devoted to her mother, and she knew that her mother was devoted to Silent Spring book. So that I think gave her extra energy to keep going. The Cranberry Scare of '59, I've mentioned. In '59 also, Carson hires Jean Davis, who was her secretary, administrative assistant up to the end, did tons of research for her, was wonderful support for her. She has a radical mastectomy in April of '60, and she kept her cancer completely secret. This was crucial because she knew the chemistry industry was going to come after her horribly when this book was published, and they did. She was hysterical. She didn't know what she was doing. They lied and said the science is all wrong, etc. But also, if they'd known she had cancer, because one of the great things about Silent Spring is she dared, one of the first people ever to dare to talk about cancer and to link it to the toxicity of these herbicides and insecticides. But if she knew that if they knew she had cancer, that they would just go after that she's just a bitter woman that's mad she has cancer. And it would give them more fodder. So she protected it. I mean, in those days, you did keep it quiet anyway, but she was particularly protective. She was very aware all the way through the publishing and the controversy thereafter of this book that she had to be really careful about what causes she supported and what causes she didn't. For instance, animal rights. She very much supported animal rights. She was horrified at animal agriculture, the horrible abuse of animals that is still going on to this day. But she didn't dare speak out about it until 1964. She wrote a preface, and I have that. If we have time, I'll read it to you. She writes a preface to a book on animal rights that's published in the UK. It was a little safer doing it there, and it was also 1964, and she knew she was dying. But it's a very strong statement. And she also was very protective she was very careful about her relationship with Marjorie and Mary because they were alternative lifestyle, and she couldn't be associated with lesbians because the chemical company would go after her for that too. And tragically, I looked up this again because I still can't believe it. Marjorie is not mentioned in the acknowledgments of Silent Spring, and it just breaks my heart. But I am quite sure from what I've read that was because she didn't dare associate. That correspondence and connection was all kept quite secret. It was dark days in those days on that subject. Okay. Let's go to Silent Spring itself now. How many of you read it whenever? Not just recently, but whenever. Yeah. Okay. What do you remember of it? Do anybody remember any unique thing about this book? Anything come to mind?
It's honesty.
What?
It's honesty.
It's honesty. Yeah. Anything else?
The science got sort of dull. I remember kind of thick scientific.
Okay. It's as science goes, it's quite lively, I'm told. I don't read a lot of science, but the fact that I could even read this science is pretty amazing. But yeah, there is a lot of science. There's no question. It's a scientific book. I mean, she's a scientist, and she's trying to prove something scientifically. Yeah?
I was tempted to put it down because the first few chapters are so much the same. There's this problem in Michigan. They don't like the worms or something, and then there's a problem in Canada, and then there's and
Where you have the fire ants and the gypsy moths.
Yeah, and it was like the same thing over and over and over again, and then finally she gets into the science. And for me, that's when it got exciting, because then she showed the similarity between these vignettes she had just told you.
Don't listen to either of them. It's so much more. I'm just joking. One of the characteristics about the book is that you remember it opens as a fable. It starts with a fable for tomorrow. Does anyone remember this? There was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. And then she has this poetic, beautiful description of this idyllic town. Then it goes on for a paragraph or so. Then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Some evil spell had settled on the community. Mysterious maladies swept the flocks of chickens. There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone? And it goes on. It sets a prophetic tone. It's an activist book from beginning to end. The famous letter that supposedly sparked Rachel Carson to write this book, but it was only one of many sparks, was a letter from Olga Huckins in January of 1958, which was published in Boston Herald paper, but also sent to Rachel Carson about a mass poisoning on Long Island. And literally, people were going out their backyard and finding dead birds or twitching, dying birds being wiped out at the time. The book is written with a voice of authority and a call to action, as I said. She gathered research, not only scientific research, but personal stories from her friends in the Audubon Society, etc., about what was happening on the ground. It is a call to action with impeccable scientific research behind her. And it's not just about pesticides or herbicides. It's a condemnation of how scientists were doing their work. She made one of the first links between genetic mutation and pesticides. The clarity of her prose is striking and often studied by students. I have students, my writing students, look at her prose. A incredible combination of poetry and science. Her ability to summarize and synthesize all this scientific research was what made Silent Spring jump out. She also built on the fear of nuclear fallout. She was very conscious of building an argument and also moving people emotionally. And one of the interesting things is how she plays with gender. The book is really speaking to housewives. And it got through. Let me read you what one author, Alex McGillivray, says about her writing style. One stylistic feature of the book deserves mention. Again and again, Carson juxtaposes ordinary housewives with men of science and business. The housewives speak at length, individually, in simple words, and are identified by hometown or name. By contrast, the control men, quote unquote, the cattlemen, the sportsmen, the chemical salesmen, the town fathers, and the federal fieldmen are gray, faceless, unquoted, and nameless. The repeated use of this device, counterpointing the personal with the impersonal, housewives with male technocrats, is one of the most mesmerizing features of the book, drawing in individual readers. A risky device, he says. But she was very she rewrote and rewrote. She wrote this, she took her 4 years to write this. Rewrote, perfected, and she was very conscious of all her metaphors, all her literary devices, with the intention, again, of getting people to act, to respond, to do something about this terrible poisoning of the planet that she so loved. She knew that the chemical companies would come after her ruthlessly, as they did. But she had supporters, thank goodness. And one of them was Eric Severide. You remember him? Yes. April 13th, 1963, after 6 months working on this hour segment, CBS Report, which was his show, did a segment on Rachel Carson, on Silent Spring. And they interviewed her, and Severide said at the time, he told his producers a month ahead of time, you've got to hurry this show up, our hero's not going to last. And in the middle of the interview, during the interview, he said later he was afraid she wasn't going to make it through the interview. And you see this on you've got to watch this documentary, or at least YouTube her, to see this. She doesn't show it. It's unbelievable. She has a wig, she's dying of cancer, she's in horrible pain, and she is articulate, and you just would not know anything was wrong. Anyway, CBS, 11 to 15 million viewers of that CBS report. And they interviewed scientists that are the chemical company scientists, and in particular, the main one, Robert White Stevens, who, lucky for the environmentalists, had dark glasses and was sort of ghoulish. You'll see him on the TV. So he was articulate, but the issue is man going to control nature, which Robert White Stevens wants to do? That's the position he was holding, or is Rachel Carson right that we have to understand there's a delicate balance in nature of which we are a part? We cannot control it. We need to figure out how to work within it. She, by the way, never said we should never use pesticides ever again, which the chemical companies kept. They published all this stuff. Well, Rachel Carson wants us to get rid of all this stuff. We're going to all die of malaria, and a lot of hysterical, purposely misunderstanding him. Anyway, Severide's report was, the book had already sold millions of copies, but then you have another 15 million people introduced to her ideas overnight in this TV show. And it was the beginning of TV, the power of television at that point. And then famously, President Kennedy, in a press conference in August of '63, is asked a question about pesticides and mentions, of course, Rachel Carson's book. We're looking into this carefully. And that was quite a moment. So briefly, let's get review after. So the book is published September '62. Rachel Carson gives talks as she is able. She's not able to do many. Some famous talks after that, the report, and then she dies in April of '64. But just to review what happened after that, let's just, there it is. After she dies, I just take this in. It still boggles my mind. So she spoke at the Senate hearing, the Ribicoff subcommittee hearing in '63. Wilderness Act is passed in '64. She dies April '64. Her posthumous book, The Sense of Wonder, and I have a copy here of her book, the book that she really wanted to fit, the only book she really wanted was this children's book on wonder. And she had it all written, but it wasn't totally finished, and it was published posthumously. Beautiful book. The Endangered Species Act, 1966. Environmental Defense Fund, 67. Grand Canyon dams defeated in '68. Friends of the Earth in '69. Greenpeace is organized in '69. Earth Day, 1970. December '70, the EPA is founded. Well, we'll talk about that. I'm about to open this to I hope will be a lively discussion. I did make references in my opening sentence, subtle though it might have been. In 1972, DDT is banned. '73, the Endangered Species Act. By the way, the Wilderness Act of '64 is one of the most important acts. It's because Denali National Park is designated, all these places designated wilderness. Fabulous. And '73, Endangered Species Act. '78, we have Love Canal. '79, 3 Mile Island. You know the rest. I want to just close with I'm going to close with a quote from my journal, and then two quotes from Carson, and then we'll open it up for discussion. This is from my journal of a year ago. I am on the verge of tears always, even thinking about her. Her delicate features, her little body, bright, clear eyes, all of which I know only from reading about her, staring at photos of her, imagining her work in an office of hunters and fishermen. She seems so delicate, so elfin. And yet out of this fragile, dying woman comes this book, comes this stand against capitalism, against arrogance, in defense of nature, whom few understood to even need defense. Out of this frail body comes voice. Excuse me. Out of this frail body comes voice, a condemnation of silence. Not only the silence of no birds, but the silence of those Not only the silence of no birds, but the silence of those who do not speak truth to power, who do not speak for those on this planet who cannot speak, the silence of complicity. And I'd like to read you the last paragraph of Silent Spring. As crude a weapon as the caveman's club, the chemical barrage has been hurled against the fabric of life. A fabric on the one hand delicate and destructible, and on the other miraculously tough and resilient, and capable of striking back in unexpected ways. These extraordinary capacities of life have been ignored by the practitioners of chemical control, who have brought to their task no high-minded orientation, no humility before the vast forces with which they tamper. The control of nature is a phrase conceived in arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man. The concepts and practices of applied entomology for the most part date from the Stone Age of science. It is our alarming misfortune that so primitive a science has armed itself with the most modern and terrible weapons, and that in turning them against the insects, it has also turned them against the earth. Amen. So let's talk and see what happens. I have lots more quotes to read you, but I'd like to open it up for questions. Are you going to walk around with the mic? No, I'm okay, thanks. I don't know what, I got something in my throat. Yes?
I'd like to hear a little bit more expanded on her cancer diagnosis. They knew she has cancer and they didn't do anything?
Well, they did something, but they didn't tell her that it was cancer.
So they just mucked around and said, go away?
Didn't give her radiation or anything.
They weren't doing radiation so that it was not an option.
Yeah, but the main thing is that she were. You want to? Do you want to say more back there? Okay. The main thing is that she wasn't told anything. So once she found out later what was going on, she went to the Cleveland Clinic. I mean, she got all the highest end help she could get, but it was 10 years later than the first diagnosis.
On another note, a concern of mine is the present-day environmental movement. I think Rachel Carson would be infuriated with them.
Yeah.
Many times, a phenomena happens, and many times the current environmental scourge is used to cover up the real reason. And I'll give you an example.
Could you hold the mic just
Okay,
a little closer?
I'll give you an example. In Quebec, one spring, a severe decline of the sugar maple bushes.
In Quebec?
In Quebec. And immediately, let's see, the current scourge, acid rain. Acid rain has got to be killing our trees. Well, it took a while for the smoke to settle. The backstory was, well, there was an open winter. Frost got deep into the ground. That moves the trees, a very serious stressor. But probably the biggest thing was they had been overtapping their maple trees for years. If the tree were big enough to have a bucket, it was on. Where the standards called for 1 bucket, they had 3. And that, I have seen too much of this type of stuff to, as to say, what is the latest scourge, and that's what's causing it. And the other thing was, many times in the scientific community, they'll have they don't know the difference between a hypothesis and proven fact. And I think that's another thing that bothers me. They'll present a hypothesis as if this has been proven. And it takes a while. And what it is, it gets to the credibility
Well,
of the whole thing.
So I'll speak to that last point. The academic community has a thing called peer review, whatever field it is, including science. So you submit any research you've done to a group of peers who are also specialists in your field, and unless they all approve that you have done the scientific method properly and you have done your research properly, it will not get published. It goes nowhere. Now, we all know that industry has been and continues to support its own research, publishes as if it were legitimate when it has not been peer reviewed, and it's been it's been funded by an industry that is not just morally but legally bound to have as their sole goal profit for the stockholders. So it's obviously they're in a bind. This is one of the readings I'd like to give you is from one of her last talks, of her very famous talk to the National Women's Press Club. I'll read it to you in a second. But there are two issues here. The peer review is essential to good science, and you can, if you go to an academic library and you talk to an academic librarian, they will tell you where the good science is and where the bad science is. There's clearly bad science out there, but there's also really good science out there, and we know that you can tell the difference by looking at that. Let me read you from her last. Is that all right if I read? There was another hand up. Can you won't forget what you're going to say? Okay. Here, from her national, this is December 62. The book came out in September. Well, it was really beginning to be out in June with the New Yorker, so it was well known by this time. She was invited to be the keynote speaker. She delivered this in her speech. A penetrating observer of social problems has pointed out recently that whereas wealthy families once were the chief benefactors of the universities, now industry has taken over this role. Now this gets complicated, right? Support of education is something no one quarrels with, but this need not blind us to the fact that research supported by pesticide manufacturers is not likely to be directed at discovering facts indicating unfavorable effects of pesticides. Such a liaison, so that gets more complicated. So I was saying that if you go to an academic librarian, you're safe, but the research, lots of the research now at big universities is funded by industry, and the tie between academia and universities are really problematic now. Such a liaison between science and industry is a growing phenomena seen in other areas as well. And get this, the AMA, American Medical Association, through its newspaper, has just referred physicians to a pesticide trade association for information to help them answer patients' questions about the effects of pesticides. I am sure physicians have a need for information on this subject, but I would like to see them referred to authoritative scientific or medical literature, not to a trade organization whose business it is to promote the sale of pesticides. We see scientific societies acknowledging as, quote, sustaining associates, unquote, a dozen or more giants of a related industry. When the scientific organization speaks, whose voice do we hear? That of science or the sustaining industry? It might be a less serious situation if this voice were always clearly identified, but the public assumes it is hearing the voice of science. And as I said earlier, we see this now. It's very clear in the history of the sugar industry, the tobacco industry, and the oil companies. Yeah, there was a hand back there, and she's been waiting patiently.
I'm not sure this is a question. It's more connecting something as you were talking.
No, reflections are welcome.
It was the movie Erin Brockovich.
Yeah, yeah.
And as I recall, Julia Roberts plays the role of a woman who does exist and is still pursuing, I think, her own course in looking at chemical effects. But I was just thinking about how she's assumed the mantle in kind of a minor way, in her own
she
way.
does
She's
what?
assumed a mantle of exploring the effect of toxic poisoning on people, and how complicated it is to take on industry.
Yeah.
And it was really more a matter of looking at a present day endeavor, or an individual with the energy to kind of take it to the next level.
Yeah, yeah.
That's all I really wanted to say.
Well, thank you for bringing her spirit into the room. There are a lot of wonderful sisters of Rachel Carson and brothers that are her legacy, carrying on her legacy. And yeah. Yeah.
How did she manage to?
I can hear you, but
You mentioned, you mentioned Severide and Kennedy and so on. How did she manage to silence or change the chemical onslaught? How were other people, major
well,
people?
She didn't silence them. We're still full of chemicals. Excuse me.
To pass all the
Causes you to drool sometimes.
I was just curious. What,
No,
there was
so
such,
just say your question again.
there's
Sorry.
just all the great legislation that was passed.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you mentioned is significant, and yet, we still haven't silenced it. But
Yeah.
you would think that she could have been undone by all of that force of the chemical
Well,
industry.
this is why I keep studying her. It is unbelievable. She had, I want to say, the force of nature behind her, literally. I mean, she just knew she had to do it. There's a letter she wrote to Dorothy about when she's trying to decide whether she's going to do it, because she knows it's going to kill her. And she feels that she can't, now that she knows that nature is so endangered, and she knows that she has access to this science, and she knows she's a really good writer, she knows that she doesn't know anyone else except E.B. White who could write as well in order to synthesize all this scientific evidence for the public to really get what's going on. The book was an activist book. She didn't want you to just read the science and go to bed. She wanted you to do something about it, right? So she just didn't know anyone else that could do it. And she said she couldn't enjoy nature. She says in this letter to Dorothy, I wouldn't be able to enjoy nature knowing that I could write this book and I didn't write it. She felt really called. And again, I think that's her Presbyterian, huge morality and sense of duty, and this Calvinism of Presbyterianism that holds nature so sacred. And her mother was very much influenced in that. And her mother was supportive of it until she died. Her mother was supporting it as well. I mean, this is 2 lives worth of dedication to the sacredness of nature. And she saw this research. All the people all over the country were doing research and reporting, not just the big things like cranberries and fire ants, but the fish kill in Mississippi. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. There was these devastating reports from all over of the effects of pesticides and DDT in particular. But your question is such a good one. It's like, how does any human being stand up to Goliath? I mean, it really was a David-Goliath situation, although she did have, as I said, like Rosa Parks, this incredible network of people who were completely committed, sending her stuff, willing to help her. Paul Brooks at Houghton Mifflin, the editor, was amazing. She sent early drafts, and she had a whole team. Writing is not a solitary activity, I want to tell you. My little book, I had a village behind me, and it's just a tiny little silly book. But she had a huge team of support. But she was so ill. There were three months in there in '61 where she couldn't even walk. She couldn't walk, much less stand. She was so sick. She was bedridden. She said all creativity had gone, and yet somehow she got back up and kept working. It's really an amazing story. I mean, I saw the documentary again last night with Lori, and I was weeping at the end of it. I mean, it's an extraordinary personal story, which is why I spend time on that. Thanks for the question.
Just a quick question.
The mic so people can hear you.
Just a quick question. She was writing about sort of chemical attacks on nature. right now you're seeing a lot of biological interventions in nature, GMOs.
Yeah.
And what would you think her reaction to the consequences and unintended consequences of the biologic intervention in nature would be?
I get this question every time I speak on Rachel Carson, and I just don't know how to answer it. I don't know enough about GMOs to. Would you like to comment on it? Because I'd like to defer to somebody who knows more than I do. I'll fall back on the general principle that she harped on in this book, which was, we are part of nature. It's a delicate, beautiful thing. Don't muck with it. Be part of it. That message comes across loud and clear. So I make guesses from there, but I don't know enough. I got in trouble the first time I answered that question. A big trouble, because I just didn't know enough to continue the conversation. So humility, that's the other thing she preaches. But it's a good question. The mic's coming around for you.
You have to remember all the legislation isn't written in the Congress, it's written on K Street. So you can understand why the legislation is what it is.
Written on what street?
Federal K Street, where all the lobbyists in the...
Yeah, okay, gotcha.
I just wanted to comment about Southport.
Legislation is written by lobbyists, he's saying. Yes.
Just a comment about Southport.
Yes. The island where her cottage was.
Yeah, her cottage is kind of facing toward the Sheepscot River.
Yes.
Where she did a lot of her writing. And the town is named, that road going to her cottage is Carson Lane. And the Southport Historical Society, I think, has every single book she's written up there. And the New Wagon Library, I think they have copies of them too, multiple copies. So she's one of the names on Southport.
Yeah. Do you know what's happened to the cottage? Does Roger still use the cottage?
Pardon?
Does Roger, her nephew, still use the cottage? Do you know?
I don't know. It's still there, and I understood that her nephew was the beneficiary.
Yes. Yeah.
And if he was from Ohio?
Well, no, he lived with her all his life. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, he might be living in Ohio now after her death. After she died, one of the things she was very worried about in her last year, once she knew she was dying, is who was going to take care of Roger. He was 10 at the time. And she put in her, she sort of left it unfinished because she put in her will either Paul Brooks, she hoped would adopt him, or Dorothy. And anyway, Paul Brooks ended up adopting him.
Anyway, a few people I know there mentioned that he was the beneficiary and did inherit that cottage, and he did come and stay there some.
Yeah.
Now, whether he's still doing it or not, I don't know.
I saw in another documentary about Rachel Carson, I did see him in the cottage, and he was on the film talking about the cottage.
I have a question here that I'm kind of torn between which way to assess things.
Could you hold the mic to your...
Have you read the book by Brian Sussman, Eco-Tyranny?
No. Tell us about it.
Well, he has a different point of view on her, not personally, but some of the science. And DDT, we discovered or created by a German scientist in the 1870s and perfected by a Swiss scientist in 39. And
saved hundreds of thousands of lives in World War II.
And there was a company in Italy that would come down with lice. And they were having a difficult time. And it was spreading, and the typhus was coming.
Yep.
And this Dr. Edwards, entomologist, he was a medic at the time.
Right.
And Merck Chemical Company sent him 500 pounds of DDT, and he sprayed it all over everybody. Yeah, that's in the documentary. She never disputed that it had saved lives. It was clear. It was the miracle chemical in World War II in terms of saving lives. What she's arguing in the book, again,
She never ever said that pesticides should never be used. But it was being used now, so irresponsible, being sprayed over millions of acres, killing everything in its wake, etc. The problem was how, it's not, as always, it's not what, it's how, right? It's how it was being used, and the arrogance with which these scientists and the chemical companies were using it without any government regulation. We're used to government regulation, weak as it is in some areas, but in those days there was no government regulation of testing of these things. That was all started with Silent Spring. Other questions?
Can I be
Do you have another one? Sure.
one more comment just to stir a little conversation?
Sure.
He points out that Carson's primary target in Silent Spring was DDT, portrayed as a lethal to humans and animals, and he says it's demonstrably false.
Well, that's a misreading of the book. DDT certainly plays a prominent part, but she's talking about our relationship to nature. She's talking about arrogance, she's talking about humility, she's talking about the intricacy of the ecological web. Ecology was a whole new word at the time. I have a member of the church in Chester, Vermont, where I preach every once in a while. He told me this amazing story. When he was in college, he's probably my age, so he was in college in the early 60s. He handed in a biology. He had read Rachel Carson as a young boy and was really involved. This is before Silent Spring is out, but she's still well known. And he wrote this paper for his biology professor in college that was based on the ecological view, right? And the professor just threw it back at him. He says, "This is garbage." And I mean, that's how new it was. And it was really, Carson was one of the, I mean, she wasn't alone, obviously. She was a whole lot of scientists. In the beginning understanding of this interconnected web of all existence. And the book really is profoundly, and a lot of commentators have said this, I'm not, that it's, yes, it's about DDT, but it's about so much more. That's one example of the kind of arrogance that she's talking about, larger picture.
Don't you think there is a much greater group of people who are closer to science, to nature, than the people that were talking about it? What I'm saying is that at the time that she was writing this, there were many people concerned about it.
Yes, oh yes, definitely.
And most of them were closer to nature than those who were not concerned about it.
Yeah, yeah.
The fishermen knew about it.
Right.
And they were seeing the effect of it. Just
Right.
like the acidity in water today, the oyster growers are recognizing that they have to grow their own seed now in a tank because the water is too acidic.
Right.
And the thing about it is there were, I would say, several million people who knew there was something wrong, something has changed, and we are trying to change nature, and they live too close to that nature and know that they're only a part of nature, and they are concerned about it.
Right.
And
right.
she best articulated everyone's thinking.
Yes, absolutely. This book is a synthesizing book.
Yeah.
She is great taking everybody else's research and stories and pulling it miraculously together in a readable book.
I'm saying, that's exactly what I'm saying. There's
Right.
so much knowledge out there that she had to pull it all together
Right.
in order to write the book. And that's what I call the honesty of her book.
Yes.
Is that she did pull the facts together, and physical facts are the only basis for wisdom.
Yeah. She also, in her revising, she would get a chapter finished, then she would send it to all the scientists who had given her the material and have them double check. She had it checked and checked again to make sure her facts were right.
Right.
I mean, she was really meticulous about that, something that's, of course, gone entirely from our culture right now.
There are always people who want to knock that person down.
Yeah, yeah. And DDT is, it was banned in the United States, but of course the companies then just sent it abroad. And it is being used in places where malaria is a really serious problem. And I can't talk to yes or no about its use out there. But it is in everything on this earth, and because it doesn't go away.
That's exactly right.
I mean, I read this morning, it's still in mother's milk. I still can't, I don't think I want to believe it, but it's everywhere. still, because it does not go away. And with the stirring up of the deep ocean, there's a whole issue of the DDT
Exactly.
coming up. Do you know? Can you say more about that? I'm really
No, I'm just an observer.
well.
I've been involved in an awful, the canal business. I was
Yeah.
not directly involved, but my company was the one that went out to
Oh
the
wow.
canal. And people came back sick of mind because they saw these children
Yeah.
that riding around hopelessly on bikes, and they were cancerous, every child. And we were the ones trying to find, trying to close things down and get some control of what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's terrible. A friend of mine was the first one to go into Nagasaki after the bomb. He was in the Navy. I was in the Navy at the same time, but he was 2 years older than I. And the thing about it is that he himself, I ended up dying of cancer too.
Yeah.
But at the time, he did not realize
Right.
the impact.
Yeah.
And I think our knowledge at the time that all of this was going on was not caught up with what was actually happening.
Right.
And we did not know what the facts were.
Yeah. The scientists did, but the thing about Silent Spring that was so amazing is that, as you said, she collated all this stuff and made it available to the average person.
But they knew theoretically, but they didn't, and they were concerned about it, but there was no way to articulate that to the people who were doing all the work and exposing
Or the
themselves
housewives
to
who
it.
are going around, wait till you see these videos. They're going around spraying with that little pump. You remember that? It's, yeah. Yes?
I wonder if there's any connection. There's a very famous scene. There's a very famous scene in North by Northwest where the people are running. It's a typical Hitchcock. The whole
Yeah.
movie they're running, and they're sprayed by a dust. And I'm just wondering.
What year was that movie?
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure
Yes.
I'm sure he's playing with all that. Yeah. Did you ever see the movie The Incredible Shrinking Man? Yeah. They're on a boat and there's this mist comes through and they start shrinking. Those are all metaphors built around that.
The early 50s was the era of the giant bug movie.
Yeah, right.
That's true. That's true.
Basically them,
Yeah.
which was the giant ants. And then there was a scorpion, there was spiders, there were,
Right.
Frogs.
Yeah. Did you want to say more about that?
No, that was my deep scientific question.
There's a question back there. Thanks, Wendy. You're being really. Who's that talk show host that goes around? No, not Donnie. The woman, Vanna White.
Oh.
Oh, whatever. Didn't she run around? Oh, well, anyway. Question.
I was surprised when you were talking about how her mother was such a devout Presbyterian, and how I think what you said was that the Presbyterians, maybe others too, believed that nature, you're a part of nature and nature shouldn't be controlled. But I heard recently, and I'm not a religious person, although I did go to the Unitarian Church, but that that the person now in charge, I won't say his name, in charge of the EPA is thinking the way that he does because he thinks that humans should control nature. And that's part of his Christian theology.
So, oh, good. I'm so glad you asked this question. So Christianity, I have done a little study of Christianity. I'm more a religious scholar than a scientist, so thank you for going in this direction. Christianity contains 360 degrees of positions on this question of man's relationship, human relationship to nature. I was generous to Presbyterianism because of Calvin, whom, of course, I can't stand 99% of what Calvin did, but wrote. But this little piece, this came from an article by Linda Sedaris, and if anyone's interested, I'll point you to the article. It's really interesting. There's a whole thing on Calvinism and Rachel Carson. And what she says in this article is that Calvinism, so Presbyterianism is how Calvinism came to the United States. And it's that sacredness of nature. And I mentioned that there was some hope in that there are some evangelical Christians now who are getting this idea that nature is sacred and we are not doing good things to it. And so I'm really hopeful that whole wing, which is a pretty big wing in the United States, will take some serious leadership around the environmental movement, which it hasn't done yet. But religious groups have taken I mean, you can trace a lot of early environmentalism to religious groups, Christian groups, usually more liberal than not. But well, the new pope is a lot better than the old popes. That's all I'm going to say about the pope. But yeah, it's very complicated because yes, the Bible has been used to take every position in the book. I mean, 360 degrees of positions on everything, which is why it's such a great book. I really do think it's a great book, but the use of it is just mind-boggling.
So are you ultimately hopeful for the future?
No, it's a disaster out there.
I know,
But let's talk about this, because I was talking to my partner Laura here about this today. It was like, no, it's a disaster.
Yes.
And we are in a particular turn towards even worse disaster in the last year, as everybody knows. So what do you do with that? So one thing is, okay, if your mother's dying, let's just take the worst scenario. The Earth's gonna go. So, not very many people believe that, but let's just say that. So the Earth is dying. Well, so your mother's dying. Do you just leave town? Oh, she's gonna die. Forget it. I gotta go. Or do you make her last days as beautiful as possible, right? So that's one argument. And I hold that a lot of days when I'm in despair. It's like, okay, I'm just gonna be steward of this little piece of land that I can take care of or whatever. Or I'm gonna fight this particular battle in this town. You know, think globally, act locally. And oh, there's a film you should, anyway, so there's that. And then there's this, then there's a position that if the humans would just stop overpopulating themselves. E.O. Wilson, have you read any of his latest stuff? He has a new book called Half Earth, and he is the leading environmentalist scientist, and he is saying that the only way this planet is going to survive is if we rewild, turn back into wilderness, one half of this planet. And
but,
he says that it's possible.
That's probably not going to happen.
He says it's possible. Read his book.
All right. I'm getting very pessimistic the more I read.
Yeah,
and the more I
so
see
here's
about
the thing
things.
about pessimism. It's a dead end. It doesn't help you, and it doesn't help the rest of us.
So what can we do?
So there are things that you can do. You can come to talks
reading.
come to talks like this and talk to your neighbors. You can watch the film Tomorrow. It's called Tomorrow. When to get it for the library and have a public showing. These young kids from France read a book, an article from Science America saying that Earth was going to be unlivable for all species, never mind humans. I mean, I wouldn't mind if humans went. It's just taking all the other species down with us that makes me furious. What right do we have to kill all these species? We're killing them 200 a day. Anyway, the film called Tomorrow, these young couples, three young couples, are like, oh my God, the planet's not going to be here for our grandchildren. We have to do something. So they got some cameras, and they went around the world and found little pockets where great things were happening. So they went to San Francisco, the waste program in San Francisco, it's amazing. The bike program in Copenhagen, amazing. They go to a little town in England, I'm so glad you asked this question. They go to a little town in England called Todmorden, where a couple of women, like you, were sitting having coffee one day in total pessimism and despair, and said, we have to do something. And they went to the town and they said, we want all the public space so that we can put vegetable gardens in for anyone to eat. So this town, I happened to be in England 2 weeks after I saw this film. And I was staying with a naturalist friend of mine, and I said, Julie, where's this town, Todmorden? She goes, oh, it's 40 minutes away. I said, we're going tomorrow. She goes, okay, okay. So and you walk around the town, and there are vegetable gardens, and there are people picking apples off of trees and beans off of bean bushes, etc. And this whole message of this town is food should be available to everybody. Everybody can work in the gardens, eat. It's all just, and there's some people who do some organizing. Of course, the Unitarian Church isn't in charge of it. But that was a footnote. No, it's my little odd humor. But anyway, see that movie. It's really upbeat because there are people all over the planet. I mean, the governments are screwing up. Our government is totally screwing up. But little towns, it's happening. There are people the little town of Norwich, Vermont, we are half solar. Half of the houses in Norwich, am I right? Close. And there was this just all volunteers, organized. This woman, Linda Gray in Norwich, volunteer, totally volunteer. She emailed me, she called me, she'd see me in the store. She goes, how is it going, Nancy, on your solar idea, you know? Not pushy, just gentle. Then when I had a question, I was exploring it, you know, like obsessively trying to figure out if we can do it. I call her, da-da-da-da-da. She was the support I needed over 2 years for me us to finally make the, finally make the decision to put solar panels on our roof, which then led to an all-electric car, thanks to Green Mountain's $10,000 discount. And anyone else got a car on that program?
No,
yeah.
I got the Tesla Powerwalls.
Oh, yeah, I will talk to you about that later. There are things happening. I mean, Green Mountain Power is happening. Mary Powell is amazing. I had the privilege of seeing her. If you ever get a chance to see her talk, go. She's amazing. And she's doing all this exciting stuff. We have, per capita, way more electric cars than any state in the country. What?
I said, how is that not hope then?
Yeah, it is hopeful. It's totally hopeful. So, but you have to not look at Scott Pruitt every day, you know? And you've got to turn the radio off on Trump, and you've got to look locally for the good news. You really have to do that because it's out there. It's happening.
I started because I was feeling hopeless.
Yeah, it's impossible not to have moments of hopelessness.
Yeah, so I started just, the only thing I could think to do when there was this assault on science, technology, engineering, math, arts, is I just did a little Facebook page called Why I Love Science, Technology.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And whenever I find any little websites about like 3D printers making houses for the homeless and the bridges where the animals can go across the freeways, you know, and
that's wonderful.
And I put all that on there, so I do find things around.
And you've just lifted the whole room up 3 feet.
Well, you know, you got to do what.
Let me give you. What's the name of the Facebook page?
It's called Why I Love Science, Technology, and Math.
Okay, we're all going to look that up and be uplifted.
Like, what do I love? And I love that. And
that's perfect.
I felt I needed to have something where you could look and there's no politics.
That's the question. What do I love? You know, ask yourself, what do I love? What am I passionate about? How does that connect with helping the planet?
Well, I just read this book that you may be familiar with, Radium Girls.
Yeah.
And it's,
Oh, I don't know it.
Oh, yes.
Radium.
Oh, is that you? Is that the book you talked about? No.
I mean, what these girls were subjected to, dying of radium poisoning.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Watch
painting
me.
dials on
Dials.
clocks. And
Yeah.
yes. The dial painters of the 30s.
That's it.
And how the industry just kept it from them, even the horrible way they died from radium poisoning, and the companies did nothing. They had cancer, their companies wouldn't tell them, their company doctors wouldn't tell them. Oh no, you're fine.
Yeah.
You know, there's nothing. The woman had her arm missing. He goes, you're fine. It's like, I have my arm cut off from cancer. You know, so I just read that, and that helped lead to OSHA. You know, something they did. You know, there's some legacy. Finally getting recognized, these women, but that was really depressing. And it's just hard to.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean,
hard to be. You know, it's like we didn't learn anything from it because the tobacco industry did the same thing, lied about what they knew. Like people know.
So
keep
this.
it from the workers, and it just seems like it repeats and repeats. And
Yeah, well, it does. I mean, I'm a Unitarian, so I'm not supposed to think evil exists, but it does. It's not. Philip Halley was a philosopher at Wesleyan and wrote wonderful books about World War II in this beautiful little town called Le Chambon in southern France, just south of of Lyon, right under the nose of the Nazis, these people saved 4,000 Jews. And the reason they saved them was because of the pastor in the town quoted this biblical passage, welcome the stranger. So when the Jewish woman hiding in the woods, starving to death with her children, dares finally to knock on, out of desperation, dares to knock on the door of the farmhouse, and the farmer's wife opens the door and looks at this woman, bedraggled, starving, and she says to the woman at the door, "Are you a Jew?" And the woman, desperate, not knowing what else to say, says, "Yes." And the farmer's wife runs to the stairs and yells for her husband, come quickly, there is a stranger at our door." And that begins the story of La Chambon, where 4,000 Jews are Underground Railroad got into Switzerland and saved. These miracles happen, and Philip Halley has a wonderful lecture that I've seen on tape where he talks about that truth and goodness are like a little flugela, a little bird, in the eye of a hurricane, and that we're all trying to do good, but we're just like little birds in the eye of a hurricane. And there's this still center that and we have to just keep pushing back the negative, the evil, the destructive. And we just have to, all of us in our own way, keep pushing that back to keep that still center alive. And that sustains me when I really get low. It's like, okay, that's the nature of human beings. Is there's a lot of bad stuff out there, and we just have to keep pushing. With humility always, not dogmatically, because as soon as you become a dogmatist, you're one of the problem. There's nothing more dangerous than a dogmatist. So it has to be done with humility. But other questions? Oh, dear. We're supposed to end. I turn into a pumpkin at 8:30. Or you do. Maybe you guys do. Any other questions? You've been wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll be hanging out to talk to you. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy.